Several months ago, Pat Gartland gave me a book to read, and it was a biography of Admiral Zumwalt, written by our speaker, Larry Berman. And he gave it to me because I was a swiftboat officer. And by the way, there are two other guys here, Bernie Wolf and Dave Wallace, who are also swiftboat guys. And anyway, Pat gave me the book to read, and I had known Admiral Zumwalt's son, Elmo. Is it Elmo the third or the fourth? Or there's a lot of Zumwalts with the numbers after their names. But anyway, I knew his son, Elmo, and from both swiftboats. I'd even met him before that when I was on my first ship. He was a guest with somebody else. And then we went to law school together at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So I got to know Elmo reasonably well. And then we went in different directions after law school. He was a year ahead of me. He got out of the Navy before I did. And I read this book not only because I was curious what it had to say about the father and son team, and so having served under Admiral Zumwalt in ComNav 4V, and then briefly when he was Chief of Naval Operations. But what was really interesting in this book was some things I learned about the political infighting in Washington, and I'm a political junkie. But some of the things I read in this biography of Admiral Zumwalt, blew me away. And I hope Larry will talk about him today, about some of the gutter snipe infighting that you can't even imagine, that I had never read about before until this book, that went on up in Washington when Admiral Zumwalt was Chief of Naval Operations. Just very briefly, Larry's got a biography that's too extensive, and he's here to speak, not me, but he was Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Davis for about 30-plus years. He's the founding dean right now in the Honors College at Georgia State University. He's made more than 40 trips to Vietnam, so he may have more time over there than some of us, actually. It's incredible. And he's written too many books to describe. So I want to introduce Larry, if I can, right now, and give him the podium. I think you're going to enjoy hearing what he has to say if it's anything like his book.
I also want to say, by just a brief introduction, that I'm going to Washington tomorrow. I've been appointed to the Vietnam Veterans National Advisory Board to the Education Center that's being built at the Wall. I don't know how many of you know about this, but a brand new education center will be built in the Wall, and 8 scholars or academics were selected to be on this advisory board. It's a great honor for me to have been selected. 4 or 5 of the professors are veterans. I am not a veteran of the war, but it's probably the highlight of my professional career to be selected. I spent so much time working with veterans and working on the war. And I might also say I work with veterans on both sides of the war, both here and in Vietnam. And obviously, having been a professor in California for so long, with so many of the ARVN troops who escaped in 1975 when the real war ended, and whose story really is probably the untold story of the war in many, many respects. Those of you who have not been to Westminster, California, I would really urge you to go and visit the new memorial there that was built to honor both U.S. and ARVN soldiers and warriors who fought together side by side in Vietnam. And it's really very moving and very powerful. It's right there in Westminster, California, a city where you might go for days and never hear English still spoken. You could be back somewhere in Vietnam. Okay. Just make some room here. This is a biography of Bud Zumwalt. I'm going to call him Bud throughout today. That's what he asked people to always call him. I knew Bud Zumwalt, but he didn't know I was writing this book. He passed away in the year 2000. But I was always intrigued by his life. He and I served together on the Vietnam Archives National Advisory Committee that he chaired. We first met when I was writing a previous book called No Peace, No Honor, Nixon, Kissinger, and Betrayal in Vietnam. Ollie referred to the backfighting and infighting in Washington. Well, it began with the hatred and bitterness that Zumwalt had for Henry Kissinger and that Kissinger had for Zumwalt. And in the book, which I won't have a lot of time to discuss right now, I characterize what happened in the years 1972, 73, and 74 as the Nixon administration was going south, the president was being impeached, and as he tried to save his political career, he tried to negotiate an agreement with the Soviets, saw that Zumwalt, the Joint Chiefs, and many people in this country felt was a bad deal for the United States. And all that infighting and all that infighting is detailed in the book. But I really want to talk to you about Bud Zumwalt today as a leader. And I know there are several Swiftboat people in the room, but also more important than that, one thing I've learned writing this book was that if you were a sailor, or if you were an enlisted person, or if you were a minority and you served in Bud Zumwalt's Navy, the odds are that you loved Bud Zumwalt because he cared about you and he took care of you. And he didn't care about the crow on someone's shoulder. What he really cared about was humanizing the Navy, something we really don't ever think about, or you don't hear military leaders talk about. From my experience talking to a lot of generals and admirals, one thing I've learned is that at these service academies, loyalty up is taught. Okay? And in the military, loyalty off, and everyone in this room understands this, loyalty up is something that you all understand and you get because that's how the military functions. Very few people at the top get the idea of loyalty down. Okay? Zumwalt understood that. And it was what really characterized his leadership, not just as CNO, but as commander of naval forces in Vietnam, the head of the Brownwater Navy from 1968 to 1970. He was a trailblazer who reformed the Navy, and he was a champion of the men and women who served in it. When he became admiral, and he was known as this iconoclastic admiral, when he became CNO, the Navy in this country was in a perilous state. It had the lowest re-enlistment rates of any service, and it was a very unattractive service for many people to be enlisting into. He realized that to prepare the Navy for the new millennium, he had to take on the challenge of bringing the Navy into the next century. So if we can go to the next slide, can you imagine a CNO who makes the cover of Time magazine in 1970, which called Zumwalt the Navy's most popular leader since World War II? He was given the nickname of Zorro, fighting for the rights and privileges of those under him, the ordinary sailors who were under his command, fighting for oppressed Navy men and women everywhere. Let me go to the next one. And when he died, and I'll come back to this, when he died in the year 2000, 2 years earlier in 1988, President Bill Clinton presented Zumwalt with the highest award our country gives to civilians, which was the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his fight on behalf of Vietnam veterans and their families and their children. Because he was the one person in the struggle for Agent Orange and Agent Orange compensation. Because Zumwalt believed that a commander's responsibility to those who served under him did not end when the war was over, but continued for a lifetime. And he dedicated the rest of his lifetime, particularly after the tragic death of his own son, to fighting to make sure that the government owned up, as it finally has, to what it owed our veterans, but not only each one of you, but your children and their children, for this terrible weapon that they were exposed to, known as a chemical known as Agent Orange. I'm not here to debate the scientific evidence of whether or not there is a positive correlation between exposure and disease. That's a highly debatable subject. But the fact is, because of what Zumwalt did, 17 to 19 new diseases are covered because of the important statistical correlation that it was as likely to have been caused by exposure as not. And that was what Zumwalt was responsible for doing in the last 15 to 20 years of his life. And it was in 1998 when President Clinton awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom that this was acknowledged. Another aspect of my book, which I've been particularly proud of the way it's been reviewed and handled, and seen by others, is the relationship between, it's an odd relationship between Bill Clinton and Zumwalt. Zumwalt really was his major military advisor with respect to Agent Orange and normalization with Vietnam and the like. But it was all done through the back door, secretly, and no one was really aware of it. I had the privilege of having a dinner with Madeleine Albright 2 years ago, and I showed her all the evidence I had. This is right before the book was published. She was Secretary of State. She had no idea what Zumwalt's role had been during this period. Pretty remarkable how Bill Clinton came to rely so much on Elmo Zumwalt. And the history of that I also chronicle in the book. Let's go to the next one. So when Zumwalt became, this is one of my favorite photos. It's a photo of a sailor who's putting a clock up, and it says, "It's time for a change." And that really is how I'd like you to think about Bud Zumwalt. One thing I've also learned right in this book is that for all the people who love Zumwalt, there's an equal long line of people who hated him, didn't like him at all. And Zumwalt was the first to acknowledge that. He always said, I have a long list of friends and a long list of enemies, and I'm equally proud of each one. And he's not the norm. One of the things that interested me in the book, and I talk about it, is how did this guy make it to the top? That is, how wasn't he weeded out of the system much earlier? How was he able to have these views? Because he really didn't hide them. And I'll talk about that briefly in a few minutes. The press quickly dubbed what Zumwalt was doing as the Mod Squad Navy, led by its psychedelic admiral. Sailors began sporting longer hair, beards, and sideburns. His infamous Z-grams attempted to meld the traditions of Navy service with the needs of the nation in turmoil and a culture that was in transition. And just like that, there were changes occurring. The Navy would never be the same. Beer dispensers were allowed in enlisted men's barracks. Acid rock blared from service clubs, and women were going to sea. Traditionalists, mostly white retired admirals, many of whom I've interviewed, and many of whom had not a single word good to say about Bud Zumwalt, ridiculed the reforms even today as the 3 Bs, as they call them: beer, beards, and broads. And they derided Zumwaltism for undoing Navy discipline and leading to mutinies at sea in 1973. And I do have a chapter in the book on those mutinies and how Zumwalt's enemies finally had a chance to take him down. But inside the Hanoi Hilton, during this time that Zumwalt was CNO, was POW James Stockdale. And Stockdale told the story often about rotting away in the Hanoi Hilton after 5 years, and a new POW arrived. And Stockdale, as he did whenever the new arrivals got there, he tapped in Morse code on the wall. "Is there any news from back home? Is there any news from back home? Please tell me." And back in Morse code, Stockdale got the following message: "Yeah, we got a new CNO. His name is Zumwalt. No more Mickey Mouse or chicken shit anymore." Stockdale said it was one of the great moments of those horrible days that he spent as a POW in Hanoi. What can I tell you about Bud Zumwalt in 15 or 20 minutes? I can tell you that he had an inspirational faith in the strength of America, its people, and its Navy. His life is defined by his service to our country, as his whole family is, 4 consecutive generations of Bronze Star recipients, including his grandson, who I just had the honor of, I've met him several times, but seeing recently in Washington, D.C. It was a lifetime defined by service, leadership, patriotism, and a real humanity. But as a leader, he earned the enmity of his adversaries, particularly people like Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon, retired admirals, Hyman Rickover. But the one thing about Bud Zumwalt that people never understood, and I think my book highlights, was Here was a guy who could maneuver in the courts of the Medici. He could outmaneuver anybody in those back rooms. And part of the intrigue of the book, I think, is how he dealt with these individuals. Imagine talking about adversaries. His enmity for the Soviet Union was equaled only by his enmity for Henry Kissinger. Because he believed Kissinger in particular would do anything to negotiate a deal with the Soviets to save the Nixon presidency, and that would leave America weaker. The other extraordinary aspect of writing this book was learning about the loyalties of people towards Zumwalt, people who would, even to this day, would go to the wall for him. He had demonstrated enormous compassion for young people serving in the Navy, and he wanted to make the Navy a microcosm of society so it would be attractive. Because in 1970, and everyone in this room, my students can't remember this, but thank God everyone in this room can, we were transitioning from a draft to an all-volunteer Navy in 1970. And the question was, and this is why Nixon chose Zumwalt, every single person who interviewed for the job of CNO, they all had a strategy for dealing with the Soviet Union. They all had a strategy for the fleet. But Zumwalt was the only one who had a personnel strategy that involved making the Navy hip and cool and attractive so that people would re-enlist, so that people would join the Navy because there was no more draft. And the Navy was not going to survive as an institution unless it changed its ways. And one of the things meant that Filipinos couldn't be left in the kitchen as stewards. African Americans couldn't continue to exist in a racist Navy that when Zumwalt became CNO, there were only 3 African American captains. Can you imagine that? No admirals. Because the Navy had practiced institutional racism for decades, ignoring Harry Truman's order, executive order, with respect to how to integrate the armed forces. Zumwalt learned very early in 2 tours and personnel duties in Washington how to prevent blacks from ever achieving. It was easy, it was simple. You rig the system, and I go over that in the book. 3 captains. And by the time Zumwalt was done in 1970, there was an first African-American admiral appointed, a great highlight of his career. When he became CNO, women were not allowed to go to sea except on the hospital ship Hope. Women were not permitted to get their fighter wings. Zumwalt changed all that. He changed it all because he anticipated incorrectly. He believed that women, of course, should serve in those capacities, but he anticipated incorrectly the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972, 73, 74, and he wanted to be on the front of that curve for the Navy, which led Ms. Magazine to list Zumwalt as one of the 10 most influential men shaping America. Pretty extraordinary for, again, somebody who was CNO. He made a difference while embodying the virtues of honorable leadership, loyalty down, and the concept that a commander had a lifetime responsibility to his troops. His humanity towards his sailors began with eliminating racial discrimination. It went on to sending women to sea, women getting their wings, Filipinos having the opportunity to advance, and the first African-American admiral appointed. And when he died in the year 2000, on his tombstone is only one word which symbolizes his life. One word, and that word is reformer. Because that in the end, is what he is, what he was. Let's go to the next one. In order to save the Navy, Bud Zumwalt embraced the redrafting and reshaping of its social contract. Something we ordinarily don't think about when we talk about leaders of service institutions, of the Navy, of the Army, of the Marine Corps. His aim was to cast the Navy in a more humane and more just light. And in doing so, he basically was telling the Navy it was grossly behind the country. and certainly the other services in regard to equality of opportunity. And he brought his enormous intellectual powers. He was probably one of the smartest people any of us would ever meet. Graduate of Naval Academy, but almost. Enormous intellectual powers to this new social contract, and the courage to take on his adversaries, because he understood the Navy would not survive into the next millennium. Let me give you the broad contours of his life very briefly. He was born in San Francisco. Why don't we go through a few of these to catch up? This will show you some of the things I was talking about. Let's just go through these. You can just go through about 4 or 5 of them. He was appointed CNO. The Z-grams, which were the way he promoted his policies. Let's keep going. The haircuts, the liberalization of regulations. Navy SEALs, Zumwalt meeting with the Navy SEALs in Vietnam in 1972. It was not uncommon for him to just, wherever he was, to sit down with his sailors. And here, obviously, this photo was chosen because of the diversity it reflected. He was a sailor's admiral. We keep going. This is the next one is one of my favorite pictures. This is when the first female admiral was appointed, Admiral Dirk, and the following picture, the next one. And this picture shows Bud Zumwalt kissing Admiral Dirk, the first woman admiral to be appointed, and he was ridiculed. The old guard came out, and they attacked him, and they said, "I can't believe you're kissing her," right on the front page of every newspaper. And Zumwalt came out and he said, "Let me just tell you, one doesn't become admiral without having to kiss a lot of asses." And here he is. I love this picture because it's our father in Washington. That's how his sailors always looked at him. He was born in 1920. He grew up in Tulare, California. I'll be speaking in Tulare in June at the Tulare Museum, where there's a section dedicated to the Zumwalt family. It's an extraordinary family. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1942. He won the Bronze Star for bravery in Leyte Gulf. That is also captured in the book. He served on destroyers his entire life, making him a black shoe admiral. Most important, he was a non-aviator, and as you all know, the glory always went to the aviators, right? And became both head of the Brownwater Navy in 1968 and then CNO. His battles with the aviators over resources and particularly with Hyman Rickover over nuclear Navy versus the Navy that Zumwalt wanted, were classic bureaucratic struggles. In many ways, it makes today's sequester look tame compared to their relationship back then. In 1968, he goes to Vietnam, and in 1970, he goes to Vietnam as the youngest 3-star admiral to serve in that capacity. He then gets promoted and goes to Washington in 1970 as CNO. He's deep selected, passing over 37 other admirals with more seniority because Nixon selected him to bring the Navy into the 20th century. A story most people really don't, 21st century, most people don't know. In 1974, at a very young age, at 54 years old, he's done. He retires. He joins corporate boards. He does what a lot of retired admirals do. He starts making some money, speaking, runs for the Senate, loses to Harry Byrd in Virginia, and then really is basically living a quiet life until one day his firstborn son, his eldest son, his namesake Elmo, who had been a swift boats commander, and in the book I detail, this is an extraordinary story. The commander of forces in Vietnam is Bud Zumwalt, and his son Elmo volunteers to go to Vietnam to test himself, and for a lot of reasons, wants to serve as a swift boat captain in Vietnam. Swift boat commander in Vietnam. His father could have killed it, but his father knew he couldn't kill it, and Elmo knew his father could have killed it, because what would happen if young Elmo was captured? And people knew that, this is the Zumwalt, his father is commanding forces. Ironically, the same thing had happened during World War II, where Zumwalt and his father were also serving in the theater of war. And what Bud Zumwalt did was he stepped aside. He allowed it to happen. And I can't really tell Elmo's story here. It's chronicled in the book. But what happened is Elmo, like Ollie and like all of you, left Vietnam. You came home. You got married. You went to law school. Whatever you did, you doctors, you began your career. You put your life back together. But Elmo had inside of him a ticking time bomb, like so many of your friends, and maybe perhaps some of you. Because as a swift boat commander, and those of you who served in swift boats, you know, you bathed in that stuff. You were in that stuff all the time. You drank, you cooked in areas that were defoliated. And Elmo came home with this ticking time bomb, working as a lawyer, one day has shortness of breath, and goes in and he finds out that he's got Hodgkin's cancer. But the terrible irony, and this is where the story gets personal, is that in 1968 it was Bud Zumwalt who issued the order to defoliate the jungles. It was Zumwalt who brought Agent Orange into Vietnam in the brown water areas, particularly in places like Seafloat and elsewhere. And the reason was very simple. His sailors were suffering casualties at such a high rate, something had to be done. They were getting picked off by the VC everywhere. They had the highest casualty rates. And Zumwalt's Navy was becoming more aggressive. It was going on the offensive. And something had to be done, and Zumwalt asked the experts in the Pentagon, what do you have that can protect the lives of my sailors? And they said, well, we've got this thing, Agent Orange. It's very effective. Zumwalt asked, is it harmful to human beings? This has all been chronicled. This is not a debatable story about what Zumwalt did. And the answer that he was given was no. Laboratories tests prove that this is only carcinogenic to plants. There is no evidence whatsoever that it's harmful to humans. Let me just tell you right now that not only was that a lie, but Zumwalt found out it was a lie. He found out that the chemical companies and the government had hid, and this is all in the book, evidence from 1966 laboratory tests, 1967 laboratory tests of positive correlations between cancers in mice and in other animals and exposure to this herbicide. But Zumwalt was unaware of that, so he issued the order to defoliate. And defoliate we did. My t-shirt, that's a great t-shirt, I agree. Defoliate we did. Only we can prevent FARS, right? Agent Orange, only we can prevent FARS. That's my other favorite t-shirt. And what happened? Casualties went down. Lots of Zumwalt soldiers, sailors who would have died didn't die. They came home and led productive lives, but others didn't. And so here's Elmo dying of cancer, and he and his father go on a 5-year struggle for a solution, for a medical miracle. They go all over. And eventually Elmo will succumb to those cancers, 2 cancers, Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And in a deathbed pledge to his son. And Bud Zumwalt, by the way, could never visit the Vietnam Memorial until President Clinton finally offered compensation to Vietnam veterans and their families because he felt responsible. He felt that so many of those names on the wall had died because of him, and he felt it's just, you can imagine what he carried inside of him. And in a deathbed pledge to his son, he promised to find out who had lied to him. Now I have to put this in context. A man who had dedicated his entire life to service, to honor, to his country, is now going to give up literally everything, all of his corporate board positions and the like, and work for $1 a year. $1 a year for Congressman Dernersky and the committee that was investigating Agent Orange and the Agent Orange cover-up. And he used the subpoena power that he had, and he was given the subpoena power, to get all the documents from the chemical companies and the like. And what he uncovered was a massive government cover-up that began with the chemical companies. And he brought this public in hearings and in testimony, and he spoke all over. Now, the lawyers ridiculed him, saying he hasn't proven anything except that there's a chance exposure could be possible. But not everyone who served got cancer. Not everyone who served in the Brown Water Navy got cancer. And what are we going to start doing? Compensating everybody? So the lawyers, that was their argument. But Zumwalt won the political argument. But he didn't win it because of Ronald Reagan or George Bush. And again, in the book, and I'll wind this up very quickly, in the book, I chronicle one of the great disappointments in Zumwalt's life, which was Zumwalt had, when he came out of, after CNO, when he decided to run for the Senate, he did so as a Democrat. He chose being a Democrat. He had never had a political party, and he had to decide what he was, a Democrat or Republican. Well, he was a Democrat on social programs and social issues, but he was clearly a conservative and a Republican on military issues. But he decided, because so many retired admirals were Republicans, and because Kissinger and Nixon were Republicans, he wanted to be a Democrat. So he actually went to the 1976 Democratic Convention and gave the keynote, and gave the defense plank speech at the convention that nominated Jimmy Carter. He was very prominent. They brought him out because he was a Democratic hawk. He was very good in that sort of context. So they brought him out, and he supported Carter in 1976. But in 1979, he was the first and most prominent person to break with Carter and formed Democrats for Reagan, because he believed had Carter been reelected, his children would not have lived in freedom. It's as simple as that, and that's part of the record. So here's Ronald Reagan and his administration when all this stuff is coming out about Agent Orange, and what does Zumwalt uncover with the subpoena power? This is the untold story that very few people really want to know. It turns out that the policy of the Reagan administration from 1985 to 1988, or 1984, was that everything that could be done by the Justice Department, particularly Ed Meese and the OMB, David Stockman, any correlation between exposure to herbicides like Agent Orange and compensation for veterans had to be mitigated, that we could not afford as a country financially to compensate veterans, because if the administration began compensating veterans for exposure to an herbicide like Agent Orange, that would open up the Reagan administration to litigation involving Love Canal and Buffalo and everywhere else where there were carcinogens in the water or where people lived or in communities, and that would throw the budget out of whack. Well, I mean, this was devastating to Zumwalt to learn this. It was the first President Bush who finally was most receptive and opened up three diseases to veterans to be and their children to be compensated. But it wasn't until Bill Clinton, who, again, great irony, and some of you might grit your teeth when I say this, turned out to be one of the greatest supporters of veterans of any president in history, and did more for veterans with respect to compensation on Agent Orange than any president in history, hands down, that's for sure. For all of his weaknesses, Bill Clinton was there when it counted for veterans, and it really did come through. That story, I think, is well documented now. So fast forwarding, just to end this, Zumwalt dedicated the rest of his life to working for veterans. And I want to read to you something. I'll close here because I know it's after 1. You've got to go and the like. And I'll take some questions if you have. I'll be happy to sign some books back there. In 1992, Bud Zumwalt went to these Renaissance weekends. These are not the Renaissance festivals where you get dressed up in costumes and eat big turkey bones and stuff. These are where the hoi polloi go in North Carolina for a weekend of thinking and exchanges, etc. And Zumwalt was invited, as was Bill Clinton and others. As a matter of fact, Zumwalt was one of the grandfathers of this, and I had the opportunity to attend my first one this past New Year's, where I did speak on this book, Zumwalt, and it was really quite moving for me to do it in a place where Zumwalt had spent so much time. Let me read to you what I found in one of Zumwalt's papers. And again, I apologize for going so quickly. All of my sources here are from Zumwalt's papers, his files, the files from archives across the country, and I've really toiled in this stuff for 5 or 6 years trying to bring this book to life. But this was one of the great things I found. Bud's handwritten notes from a talk he gave at a December 1992 Renaissance weekend offer a glimpse into his public battle and private agony. His remarks were titled, "Whoops, Mistakes and Their Consequences." And here's now I'm reading Bud Zumwalt. As many of you know, I was the commander of U.S. naval forces in Vietnam. who decided in 1968 to use Agent Orange to defoliate the vegetation along the banks of the narrow canals and rivers of the Vietnam Delta. At the time, it seemed to be an intelligent decision. The U.S. Army had been using Agent Orange for 3 years. They believed their experiences had confirmed what the military had been assured by the chemical companies, that the only known human ill effects were the development of chloracne on the skin and on some exposed individuals. As is now well known, 20 years later in August 1988, Musa and I lost our firstborn son, Elmo III, from both Hodgkin's disease and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I have been deeply saddened by the additional insight gained. Chemical companies producing dioxin byproducts had known for many years that these substances were harmful. They have exchanged data amongst themselves about such harmful effects, and they delayed, in some cases many years, in making their reports known to the government concerning these harmful effects. I'll close that quote. See, Zumwalt had asked all the right questions, but he received dishonest answers. And he was intent on this not happening again. And when the Persian Gulf War began, he contacted Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, and said, do you know how important it is that we have to know where our troops are? Because if Saddam or anyone uses chemical weapons, we've got to be able to track this. We've got to know. And he was right on it. And every night during that Persian Gulf War, he and his wife, Musa, a wonderful love story in itself, lived in the great fear that they would receive another phone call because their son, Jim Zumwalt, who's become a dear friend of mine, was a Marine serving in the Persian Gulf during that time. The story goes on, but again, I know you've got to go back to work. I'll take questions. I want to thank you. I hope I wasn't too disorganized. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us a little bit about your trips back to Vietnam? I know you've been there 40-plus days. You've been in today. Is the
we're going to pick that back up in the fall. He's going to come back and
I'll answer that very
for us.
Yeah, so I'll answer that.
The elephant's still standing in Da Nang, and is the surf still up in China Beach and Red Beach?
The China Beach is still there. It's beautiful, and Da Nang itself has been rebuilt actually into a very nice city in the last couple of years. And of course, the road to Hoi An now is not VC populated; it's safe, and so you can actually you can go to Marble Mountain and take the road from Da Nang all the way up to Hoi An and see some beautiful vacation spots and the like. And you can do what you want. But I want to say one thing about Da Nang. Those of you who are stationed in that area, even to this day, there are areas. So if you want to learn about Agent Orange, as Zumwalt did, Zumwalt was the first and highest ranking member of the military to return to Vietnam, and he did that for one reason. He was on a mission to find out about Agent Orange because he had this theory. Well, we could look at our sailors here, or why don't we go to Vietnam and take a look at what's going on there? The Vietnamese are still there, right? Let's take a look. Well, there are these hotspot areas right now that you still cannot go to because they're literally like Chernobyl. And I don't want to get into this whole debate about whether or not this is propaganda. It's not. Okay? You cannot go in certain areas outside of Da Nang. And I know this because the story I'm going to tell in October is when I took my best friend, Michael Holmes, a Marine, back to Vietnam, who went down to Khe Sanh on Hill 871 in March of 1968 and never wanted to go back. Hated Vietnam, hated everything about that war, and had so many demons in him that it almost cost him his life several times. And then one day he said to me, "Hey, little buddy, I'm ready to go back, but you're taking me." And that was one of the heaviest things in that presentation called Michael's Reconciliation.
And
that's where I learned.
We're going to talk about that in, I think it's September. When do I have
I think it's October.
October, excuse me. In October, he's been all over Nam, and he's going to be able to tell you what it's like now, and he'll have pictures as well.
2 hours.
And we'll do it in 2 hours. Okay.
All right, any other questions? I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Again, I'm really honored to be here. And let me just say, I'm the age of I'm about 4 years younger than a lot of you who served. And I had a lottery number. I still remember the day I got it. And then Nixon called off the draft. I was named after my father's brother, Lenny, who was killed in the last days in a bad little bulge. One of the great things I did for my family was go back into the National Archives as a historian and trace Lenny's last days. which any of you could do for any members of your family. And in my own family, service and commitment was very, very important. And as I say, I was 18 years old and I got that lottery number. And then Nixon called off the draft in Vietnam, was South by then, but never met a Vietnam veteran who I did not honor and respect. And I'm honored to consider you brothers, even though we didn't serve together. So I'm humbled to be here. Thank you.
Professor Berman, we wanted to give you a little token of our appreciation for an incredible talk. As you might know, challenge coins first came about during the Roman legions, when special people were given challenge coins so they could move freely among the legion, and it told the commanders to make sure that they had hospitality, and make sure that they had safe harbor. You're always welcome with us. Thank you.